The reservation was for 7 o'clock. I arrived at 6:53. The maître d' at Maison Verbier had been seating me for 12 years. His name was Pascal. He kissed my cheek the way he kissed the cheek of every regular, lightly, professionally. He said, "Madame Holcomb, bienvenue. Monsieur Holcomb is already at the table." I said, "Thank you, Pascal." I followed him through the dining room. The light from the chandeliers was the color of butter. The tablecloths were the color of cream. The room smelled like rosemary and good butter, and the particular smell of money being spent slowly. My husband Garrett was at our usual table by the window. He stood up when he saw me. He was wearing the navy suit I had bought him for his 40th birthday. He was smiling the smile he saved for closing deals. There was a woman sitting across from him. She was 26 years old. She was wearing a soft pink dress that fit close to her body and stopped above her knees. She was visibly pregnant. Maybe 5 months, maybe 6. She did not stand. She looked up at me, and her face did something that was almost, but not quite, an apology. Garrett said, "Della, sit down. There is something we need to discuss. This is Sienna. She needed to meet you." I did not say anything for a moment. I let the silence land. Pascal pulled my chair out. Pascal had no idea what was happening. Pascal still thought he was seating 2 regulars for their anniversary dinner. I sat down. The waiter came over. He had a bottle of the white Burgundy Garrett always ordered. He began to pour into my glass. I said, "Excuse me, could you bring me a glass of champagne instead? The Pol Roger if you have it. Thank you so much." The waiter paused for half a second. He nodded. He left. Garrett's smile stopped reaching his eyes. He had been planning to say something next. I had moved before he had. Welcome back to Broken Relations Stories. If you are new here, we tell stories about the women who saw it coming. The women who heard the door close before anyone else realized it was a door. Drop a comment, tell me where you are watching from, hit subscribe if you have not, and let me take you back to where this story actually began. Not to that restaurant, to a Sunday in February of the previous year, when my sister, who is a divorce attorney in the city, accidentally got my mail. My name is Della Holcomb. I am 42 years old. I have been married to Garrett Holcomb for 13 years. He is 45. He owns a small commercial real estate development company called Holcomb Properties that he started in 2014 with $80,000 of his own money and $200,000 of mine. We have 2 children, a daughter named Annabelle, who is 9, and a son named Otto, who is 7. We live in a brownstone in the city that we bought together in 2017 when Annabelle was 3. Before the kids, I had been a freelance food writer. I had published in 3 of the 4 major glossy food magazines that existed at the time. I had a column for 2 years in a regional weekly. I had been on my way to writing a cookbook when I had Annabelle, and the cookbook had become a folder of recipes in a drawer in the kitchen. And the kitchen had become the only place I wrote anything at all, and that, more or less, was how the next 9 years had gone. Garrett built, I cooked, the kids grew, the brownstone held. We had dinner parties on Sundays. We had a good marriage. I thought we had a good marriage. There is, I have learned, a particular kind of woman who can be married to a man for 13 years and not know, until a credit card statement arrives at the wrong address, that her marriage has been a stage set for 14 months. I want to tell you about the $200,000 because it matters for what comes next. The money was mine. It had come from my grandmother, who had been the kind of grandmother who quietly invested in IBM in 1962 and never told anybody about it for 30 years. She had died when I was 27, the year before I met Garrett. She had left a small inheritance split between me and B, and mine had been about $240,000 after taxes. I had kept it in a savings account because I had not known what to do with it. In 2013, when Garrett came to me with his business plan, with the spreadsheets and the projected returns, and the easy confidence of a man who had been told all his life that he should be allowed to do whatever he wanted, I had handed him $200,000 of my grandmother's money. He had said, "Della, I am going to make this back 10 times for us." He had said it the way men say those things, like a promise that was also slightly a threat. I had said, "Garrett, I want it documented. I want my name in the company." He had said, "Of course, sweetheart, we will set it up properly." We had not set it up properly. The money had gone into the LLC as a personal loan from him to himself, repayable on terms that were never written down. My name had never been on the cap table. I had asked him about it twice over the years, lightly, the way you ask things when you do not want to seem like you do not trust your husband. He had waved it away both times. He had said, "Della, it is just the way the corporate structure works. It is cleaner this way. The company is technically mine, but it is ours. Do you understand the difference?" I had understood the difference. I had let it pass anyway. I did not know then that I was going to spend the next decade letting things pass that I should not have been letting pass. I know it now. I have written it down. I am writing it down right now, so that someone watching this video who has $200,000 in a savings account and a charming husband with a business plan can hear me say one thing very clearly. Get it in writing. Put your name on the paper. Do it before the wedding. Do it before the baby. Do it before the brownstone. Do it now. I love you. Get it in writing. I met Garrett at a wine bar in the West Village in October of 2011. I was 28 years old. I had been writing a freelance piece on a sommelier who worked there, and I was supposed to be doing a follow-up interview, and the sommelier had been late, and Garrett had been at the bar in a navy blazer, drinking a glass of something he had clearly been advised on by someone smarter than him. He had introduced himself by leaning over and asking what I was reading, which was a copy of M.F.K. Fisher's An Alphabet for Gourmets, which I had been reading on the subway because the sommelier was the kind of person who appreciated literary references during interviews. Garrett had not heard of M.F.K. Fisher. He had laughed about it, but in a way that suggested he was charmed by his own ignorance. And I had been 28, and I had been single for a year, and I had been the kind of woman who took compliments seriously when they came from men who looked like they could afford the place we were drinking in. Within 3 weeks, we had gone to dinner 4 times. Within 3 months, we were spending every weekend together. Within 9 months, he had proposed at the top of a hill in upstate New York during a weekend trip with 2 other couples I no longer speak to. I said yes on the hill. I called B from the car on the drive back. She was quiet on the phone. She said, "Della, are you sure?" I said yes. She said, "Then I am happy for you, honey." I have thought about that quiet over the years. I have thought about how long she sat with what she did not say, and how kindly she did not say it. I am not angry at her for not saying it. I am only sad in a way I cannot fully explain, that I had not yet been the kind of woman who could have heard it. My older sister Beatrice, who everyone calls B, lives 11 blocks from me. She is 49. She is a partner at a family law firm in Midtown. She has been a divorce attorney for 22 years. She is the most patient person I know, and also the most exacting. And the combination of those two things has made her the kind of attorney that other attorneys quietly recommend when they have a friend who needs the best in the city. B and I have been close our entire lives. She did not have children. She had 2 cats and a husband who died of a heart attack in 2019 at 47. She had not remarried. She had taken her grief and folded it into her work, and her work had become a kind of sustained, careful attention to women who had been told by their husbands to be quiet. B, on a regular Sunday, would come to brunch at our brownstone and sit at my kitchen counter and drink coffee and watch Garrett move around the room. She did not say much in front of him. She did not need to. I had been watching her watch him for a long time before I understood what she had been seeing. In February of the previous year, on a Sunday, the post office had misdelivered a piece of mail. It was a credit card statement in Garrett's name, addressed to our brownstone, that had gone to B's mailbox instead because the carrier had been new and had confused the street numbers. B, being B, had not opened it. She had picked it up off her foyer floor and tucked it into her bag and brought it over for brunch. She had set it on the counter. She had said, "Della, this was in my mail. The carrier is new." I had said, "Thanks, B. I will give it to Garrett." I had taken the envelope. I had set it on the corner of the counter where I kept the bills to be opened. The corner of the counter had a small stack. The stack was always slightly out of order. The stack was always things I would get to. I do not know even now why I opened that one. It was sealed. It was Garrett's mail. He always opened the credit cards himself. He had an entire system for tracking business expenses across our personal cards. It was the kind of system that made him feel important and that made me feel like I should not interfere. I opened the envelope. Maybe because B had left and I was alone in the kitchen. Maybe because the kids were at school and the house was quiet. Maybe because I had been having a feeling for about 3 weeks that I had been trying not to have. I opened it. I sat down on the kitchen stool. I read the statement. There were the usual charges: the dry cleaner, 2 business dinners, a flight to Chicago that I had known about, and then at the bottom, in the section for the previous month, a charge for $1,427 from a maternity boutique on Madison Avenue. I read that line. I read it again. I had not been pregnant in 7 years. I had nieces. The youngest one was 14. I knew nobody who was pregnant who Garrett would be buying $1,427 worth of maternity clothing for. I closed the statement. I folded it. I put it in the drawer where I kept the kids' birth certificates, behind the manila envelope with Otto's vaccination records. I did not say anything to Garrett that night. I did not say anything to B. I went to bed at the regular time. I lay awake until 4. I have learned to lie awake until 4 the way some people learn to play an instrument, with practice. The next day I called B at her office. I said, "B, I need to ask you a hypothetical question." She said, "Della, hypothetical means you do not need to ask hypothetically. Come over after work." I came over after work. I told her about the statement. I told her about the feeling I had been having. I told her about the way Garrett had been working late, and the new haircut, and the cologne I did not recognize, and the gym membership he had not told me about, which I had found a receipt for 2 months earlier and had put away in a different drawer. Bea listened. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "Della, I am your sister, but I am also a divorce attorney. I am going to talk to you as your sister first. Then, if you want, I will talk to you as your attorney. As your sister, I want to say that I have been worried about you for a year. I have not said anything because it is not my place to say things in a marriage that is not mine. As your attorney, I want to say that you need to start documenting things, and you need to do it carefully, and you need to do it without him knowing. Will you let me help you?" I said yes. The next 14 months were the longest months of my life. I did not confront Garrett. I did not change my behavior. I did not let him see anything in my face. I made his coffee in the morning. I asked him about his day. I went to bed at the regular time. I lay awake until 4. While I lay awake, I made lists. While the kids were at school, I copied documents. I made digital copies of his credit card statements. I made photocopies of business records I found in his home office. I tracked his receipts. I forwarded screenshots to Bea on a secure email account she had set up for me. Bea, in parallel, hired a forensic accountant named Penelope Voss, who was 52 and had spent 20 years auditing financial fraud for the federal government before going private. Penelope did not meet me. Penelope worked through Bea. Penelope, over those 14 months, slowly built a picture of where the money in our marriage had been going. The picture was uglier than I had imagined. It was not just the affair. The affair was the smallest part of it. Garrett had been diverting funds from our joint accounts into a side LLC he had registered in Delaware in late 2022. The LLC was called Verbier Holdings, named with a particular kind of cruelty after our anniversary restaurant. The LLC held approximately $340,000 by the time Penelope was done counting. Garrett had been buying his mistress an apartment. He had been planning to move her into it. The deed to that apartment was scheduled to close, Penelope estimated, within 90 days. I want to pause here for a second. I want to be honest about what those 14 months were like. There were days I almost broke. There were nights I lay next to him and thought, I should just say it. There were mornings I made his eggs and watched him eat them and thought, you do not deserve eggs. You deserve to know what I know. I did not say it. I went to Bea's apartment most Wednesday nights while Garrett had what he called client dinners. Bea would pour me a glass of wine. We would sit on her couch with the documents Penelope had sent. We would build the file. We would put one more piece in. Bea would say, Della, you are doing the hardest part of this. You are being patient. Patience is a kind of love. It is the love of yourself you are showing right now. You are showing yourself that you are going to handle this the way you need to handle it, not the way he wants you to handle it, not the way the world expects you to handle it. Your way, in your time, with your evidence in your hand. I would nod. I would drink the wine. I would go home. I would lie awake until 4. The hardest Wednesday was in October. Penelope had sent over photographs that day. She had not taken them herself. A colleague she trusted had taken them. They were of Garrett and Sienna leaving the maternity boutique on Madison Avenue with shopping bags. Garrett was holding the door open for her. Sienna was 3 months pregnant by then, just barely showing, her hand resting on the small curve of her stomach in the unconscious way pregnant women do. Garrett was laughing. He had not laughed like that with me in 9 years. I do not mean he had not been happy in 9 years. I mean the specific laugh I was looking at in that photograph, the one where his head was tipped back and his eyes were closed, was a laugh I had not been the cause of in a long time. I sat with the photograph for a long minute. B did not say anything. She just put her hands on top of mine on the coffee table. Eventually, I said, B, the hardest part is not what he is doing to me. The hardest part is that he looks happy. She said, Della, I know, honey. That is the hardest part for everyone. I did not cry that night. I cried 2 nights later while making dinner when Annabelle came into the kitchen and asked me why Daddy had stopped reading her stories before bed, and I had to make up an answer about him being tired from work. I had been making up answers like that for a year. I did not know how many more I had in me. B had said, Della, you only need to make it through to the anniversary. I had nodded. I had been making it through, one made-up answer at a time for months. I also want to tell you about the kids during those 14 months, because they are the reason I waited as long as I did. Annabelle was 8, then 9. She had started noticing things. She had asked me in March why Mom and Dad did not hug anymore the way other moms and dads did. She had asked me in June why Dad's voice on the phone in his office was different from his voice at dinner. She did not know what she was noticing. She was a child. She was paying attention without knowing what to do with the attention. Otto was 7. Otto was less observational than Annabelle, but he had begun to flinch slightly when Garrett raised his voice during family meals, which Garrett did more often than I had realized until I started keeping count. Garrett did not hit the kids. Garrett did not even exactly yell. Garrett just had a voice that, when he was annoyed, sharpened into something hard and metallic. And Otto, who was a soft child with soft feelings, did not like that sound. I had been navigating around that sound for a long time. The kids had been navigating around it longer than I had been admitting to myself. I told B about it once. She said, Della, the kids are going to be fine. The kids are watching you and they are learning what a woman does when she is being treated this way. The longer you stay, the longer that lesson runs. The day you leave is the day the lesson changes. I had not been ready to hear that for a long time. By the anniversary, I had been ready to hear it for 6 months. If you have ever spent 14 months looking at a person you loved, knowing what they were doing to you, and waiting for the right moment to act, then you know what that kind of quiet costs. It costs your sleep. It costs your appetite. It costs the woman in the mirror who used to laugh at her own jokes. But it gives you something back. It gives you the certainty that whatever you do next will not be a reaction. It will be a choice. If this is hitting close, drop a comment. Subscribe if you have not. We are about to get to the dinner. Garrett scheduled the anniversary dinner himself. He told me about it 3 weeks before. He said, Della, Maison Verbier, our anniversary, 7 o'clock, the 14th. I have already made the reservation. Wear the black dress. I did not blink. I said, that sounds lovely, Garrett. Thank you for thinking of it. I told B about it that night. B said, "He is going to do it at the restaurant. Della, he is going to do it at the restaurant." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "He is going to bring her. He is going to tell you there, a public place. So you cannot make a scene. So you have to be civilized. So you walk out of that dinner already on the back foot. It is a tactic. Trust me, I have seen it 3 times in 20 years. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "B, what do we do?" She said, "We let him do it, and we be ready. And when he does it, you make one phone call, and I walk into that restaurant 11 minutes later with everything we have built." I said, "B." She said, "Della." I said, "I am scared." She said, "I know. So am I. But we have done the work. Whatever you feel in that moment, the work has already been done." The night of the anniversary, I dressed carefully. I put on the black dress Garrett had asked for. I wore the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. I put on the makeup Sienna would see, because I had decided that if Sienna was going to see me, she would see a woman who had taken time to be in her own skin. I took a car to the restaurant. The car got there at 6:50. I sat in the back seat for 3 minutes. I looked at my phone. There was one text from B. It said, "I am at the coffee shop on the corner. I have the file. I have my coat on. I am drinking a decaf. Tell me when." I texted back, "Got it. Going in." I tipped the driver. I walked into Maison Verbier at 6:53. Pascal kissed my cheek. He led me through the dining room. The light was the color of butter. The tablecloths were the color of cream. My husband stood up. There was a 26-year-old pregnant woman across the table from him in a pink dress. He said the words I had been waiting 14 months to hear, and they came out exactly the way B had said they would. And I sat down and I asked for a glass of champagne instead of the wine, and Garrett's face did the small thing that faces do when they understand they have lost control of a conversation before the conversation has begun. The waiter brought the champagne. He poured. Garrett waited until the waiter was gone. Then he leaned forward across the table. He said, "Della, I have wanted to tell you for a long time. Sienna and I have been seeing each other. She is pregnant. We have decided to be honest with you. I want a divorce. I think the kindest thing we can do is to handle this civilly. I have already spoken to an attorney. I will be generous. I want you to know that. I do not want this to be ugly." Sienna did not say anything. She was looking down at the napkin in her lap. I looked at her. I looked at Garrett. I picked up my champagne. I took one sip. I set the glass back down. I said, "Sienna, may I ask how far along you are?" She looked up. She looked at Garrett. Garrett nodded slightly. She said, 20 weeks. I said, "That is a nice point in a pregnancy. The hard part of the first trimester is over. You can find out the gender at 20 weeks if you want to." "Have you?" She said, "A boy." I said, "Congratulations." I picked up my phone. I dialed B. She picked up on the first ring. I said, "Now would be good. Yes, both of them are here." I hung up. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked at Garrett. I said, "Garrett, I have already spoken to an attorney as well. She will be here in 11 minutes. She is my sister. You have met her many times. I think you are going to find that the divorce we are about to discuss will not look very much like the divorce you are planning to propose to me tonight." Garrett's face went still. The smile that had been working so hard all evening did not come back. Sienna looked from him to me and back. She said very small, "Your sister is an attorney?" I said yes. She is one of the better divorce attorneys in this city. I imagine if you had asked Garrett what he was planning to do this evening, he might have mentioned that I had a sister who did this for a living. He did not, did he? Sienna did not answer. She did not need to. Bee walked into Maison Verbier at 7-Eleven in her gray wool coat with her leather briefcase in one hand and a small white envelope of paperwork in the other. Pascal led her to the table. He had no idea what was happening. None of the diners around us had any idea. Bee did not raise her voice once. She set the briefcase on the empty chair beside me. She handed Garrett the envelope. She said, "Mr. Holcomb, I am Beatrice Eames with Eames, Whitfield, and Patel. I represent Della in this matter. This is a divorce petition. It has not been filed yet. We are giving you 24 hours to review it with counsel of your choosing. If we do not hear from your attorney by 7 p.m. tomorrow evening, it will be filed at 8 a.m. the following morning. The petition cites infidelity, which is documented. It also references a separate matter regarding the financial conduct of the marriage over the past 18 months, which has been independently audited by a forensic accountant. The audit has identified approximately $340,000 in marital funds that have been moved into a Delaware LLC called Verbier Holdings, which we understand you control. Those funds will need to be returned to the marital estate pending settlement. We have also filed this morning an emergency motion to freeze the assets of Verbier Holdings, including but not limited to the apartment purchase you have been pursuing. The motion was granted at 4:30 this afternoon. Your closing on that apartment, which I understand was scheduled to occur within the next 10 weeks, will not be closing. Additionally, regarding custody of Annabelle and Otto, we are proposing that Della retain primary physical custody. We are willing to discuss a visitation schedule, though we will be requesting that initial visits with Ms. Sienna present be supervised, pending family counseling, given that the children have not yet been informed of the situation. We will be requesting that you vacate the family residence by Sunday evening. Do you have any questions for me, Mr. Holcomb?" Garrett's face had gone the color of wet plaster. His hands were on the table in front of him. He did not pick up the envelope. He said, "Della, we can talk about this. We do not need attorneys. Sienna, give us a minute. Let me talk to my wife." Sienna stood up. She was 26. She was 5 months pregnant. She was holding her small pink clutch, and she did not know what to do. Bee looked at her, not unkindly, and said, "Ms. Belmonte, you are welcome to wait at the bar. I would suggest you also retain counsel. I am not your attorney, but I will tell you, as an observer, that the man you are sitting next to has not been honest with you either, and the financial picture you have been given about his business affairs is not accurate. You should know that. Independent of Della's divorce, you are a young woman about to have a child, and you have legal rights as the mother of that child, separate from anything Mr. Holcomb has told you. I would not advise you to remain in this conversation. I would advise you to call a friend, go home, and talk to a lawyer tomorrow." Sienna stood there for 1 second. Then she walked away from the table toward the bar. She did not look at Garrett. She did not come back. Garrett did not try to talk to me. He understood, finally, that there was nothing to say. He picked up the envelope. He stood up. He said, I will have my attorney call you tomorrow. B said, "We will be in the office at 9 a.m. Good evening, Mr. Holcomb." He left. He did not pay the bill. Pascal, who had been hovering at a tactful distance, came over confused. B handed him her credit card. She said, "Pascal, we will be staying for dinner. We will be ordering the tasting menu. Please bring us a bottle of the rosé champagne. And please send Madame Holcomb's apologies to Monsieur Holcomb, who has had to leave unexpectedly." I burst into tears. Quietly. Not loud enough for anyone 2 tables away to hear. B reached across the table. She held both my hands. She said, "Della, you were so brave. You were so brave." I said, "B, I am not brave. I am just done." She said, "Honey, those are not different things. They are the same thing. Drink your champagne. You earned every bubble of it." The next morning, Garrett's attorney called B's office at 9:04 a.m. The negotiations that followed lasted 3 months. By the time they were done, Garrett had agreed to a settlement that returned the diverted $340,000 to the marital estate, awarded me primary custody of Annabelle and Otto, gave me the brownstone outright, gave me half of the legitimate value of Holcomb properties as of the last clean audit, gave me a substantial portion of Garrett's retirement assets, and required Garrett to pay child support based on his full historical income, not the lower number his attorney tried to use in the early rounds. The Verbier Holdings LLC was dissolved. Garrett's investors, who had been gently informed by Penelope's discreet network of professional contacts that the founder of Holcomb Properties had engaged in some financial conduct worth their attention, quietly began to ask for audits of their own accounts. 3 of them left within the year. Garrett's company did not collapse, but it did contract substantially. He moved into a 1-bedroom rental 6 blocks from our brownstone. I want to tell you what those 3 months of negotiation were like, because I think people imagine a divorce settlement as a single dramatic meeting in a wood-paneled room. It is not that. It is months of letters between attorneys. It is responses to interrogatories. It is asset disclosures. It is depositions where you sit across a conference table from a man you slept next to for 13 years and watch him answer questions under oath about money he hid from you. Garrett's deposition was on a Tuesday in June. I attended. I did not have to. B had asked me whether I wanted to. She had said, "Della, some women find it helpful. Some women find it traumatic. There is no right answer. You can decide the morning of." I had decided the morning of. I had decided to go. I had sat in the back of the room in a navy dress and watched Garrett swear under oath with his hand on a Bible that he would tell the truth about the financial conduct of our marriage. He had then lied 4 separate times within the first 40 minutes. B's questions had been so quietly precise that he had not realized he had lied until B, with the small smile of an attorney who has just laid a trap, pulled out documentation that contradicted him. I watched his face each time. I felt nothing. I had used up my feelings during the 14 months of waiting. The deposition was just paperwork by then. After it was over, B walked me to the elevator. She said, "Della, how are you?" I said, "I am fine. I am hungry. Can we get sandwiches?" We got sandwiches. I went home. I made pasta for the kids. I read Annabelle a story. I went to bed. I slept until 7 the next morning for the first time in a year. Sienna had her son at the end of the summer. She and Garrett were no longer together by the time the baby was born. She had taken Bee's advice. She had hired her own attorney. She had filed for child support and a paternity acknowledgement. She had moved back in with her mother in New Jersey. I never met the child. I have wondered sometimes what he looks like. I hope, in a way, I have not entirely worked out that he is going to be all right. He did not choose any of this. Annabelle and Otto were 9 and 7 when I told them. Bee was at the brownstone with me. We sat on the floor in the living room. I had practiced the words for weeks. I told them that Dad and I were going to live in different houses. I told them that Dad had not been honest with me about something important, and that I was very sad about it, and that they were going to see Dad regularly, and that Dad still loved them, and that nothing about my love for them was going to change, and that they were allowed to have whatever feelings they were going to have, including the angry ones, and the confused ones, and the ones that felt like nothing at all. Annabelle cried. She cried for 20 minutes. Otto did not cry. Otto asked one question. He said, "Mom, will you still make the pancakes on Sundays?" I said, "Otto, I am going to make you the pancakes every single Sunday for the rest of your life if you want me to." He nodded. He went and got his stuffed elephant. He came back. He sat in my lap. He stayed there for an hour. Bee sat on the couch and watched us. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. I started writing again, not in the kitchen anymore, in the small back room that had been Garrett's home office. I painted it the color of the inside of a peach. I bought a writing desk at an estate sale in Vermont. I brought the folder of recipes out of the drawer in the kitchen and put them on the desk in alphabetical order. I started a column for a regional food magazine called Hearth, run by a woman who had been the editor of one of the magazines I had written for when I was 26. She had reached out to me when she heard, through the mysterious networks that women of a certain age move through, that I might be looking for something. The column was about the meals that women cook for themselves when nobody else is in the house. It paid almost nothing. It was the work I had been wanting to do for 9 years. The first column was about a single roasted chicken. I had been making that chicken once a week since the divorce was finalized. I would roast it on a Tuesday night when the kids were at Garrett's. I would eat the breast that night with a piece of bread and some greens. I would shred the rest of the meat on Wednesday for a salad. I would simmer the carcass on Thursday for stock. I would freeze the stock in small containers for soups in the winter. The chicken was not just a chicken. The chicken was the structure of a week I was learning to spend alone. I wrote about that. The editor wrote back to me 3 days after I submitted it. She said, "Della, this is the best thing you have ever written. We are going to give you the back page." I have written 14 columns since. I have signed a small book deal. The book will come out in 2027. The book is called Tuesdays. It is dedicated to my sister. It is 16 months after the anniversary dinner now. I am writing this from the kitchen of the brownstone on a Saturday morning in May. The kids are with their father this weekend. He picked them up yesterday afternoon. He was on time. He has been on time for 14 straight months, which is more than I can say for the previous 13 years. I do not know if he has changed. I do not need to know. I only need to know that Annabelle comes home on Sundays and tells me about the bookstore they visited. I only need to know that Otto has stopped flinching when Garrett raises his voice, because Garrett, in my best assessment, has finally learned not to raise his voice. The kids are healing, slowly, the way kids do. I have not dated. I have not wanted to. I have instead been learning to be the person I was before Garrett, with the additional knowledge of the person I was during Garrett. The two of them are not the same woman. The 28-year-old at the wine bar was a woman who said yes too easily. The 42-year-old in the brownstone is a woman who has learned to listen to the second voice. There is always a second voice when something is wrong. The 28-year-old had a second voice. She did not know it was speaking. The 42-year-old hears it now, in the first sentence. I will not say I am grateful for the marriage. I am not grateful for the marriage. I am grateful for the woman I had to become to leave it. Those are not the same things. B is coming over for brunch in 40 minutes. She is bringing fresh croissants from the bakery on Sullivan Street. I am making my grandmother's hash browns, which are simple potatoes and good butter and salt, but which nobody in my family can ever quite get to taste the way she made them. I am closer than anyone. I have been working on it since I was 11. I think one of these Saturdays I am going to get it right. I have time. I have a lot of time. I have all the Saturdays from here forward, and none of them are scheduled around someone else's dinners. The cardinal that visits B's bird feeder at her apartment, which she put up after her husband died, came over to my fire escape last week. I do not know if it was the same bird. Probably not. I like to think it was. I left a piece of bread on the railing. It took the bread. It flew away. I told B about it on the phone. She laughed. She said, Della, birds find the houses where there is something for them. You have made your house a place a bird can come to. Do you understand what that means? I said, I think I do. She said, good. If you made it this far, I want you to know something. I do not regret one single day of those 14 months I spent gathering paperwork. I do not regret the lost sleep. I do not regret the lonely brunches when B and I sat in her apartment with a folder full of evidence and a bottle of wine. I do not regret the patience. The patience was the thing that gave me back to myself. The patience told me every single night I lay awake until 4 that I was not the woman my husband had decided I was. I was a woman who had been a journalist. I was a woman who had made $200,000 of seed money and watched a man build a company with it without ever once writing me into the cap table. I was a woman who had a sister who knew exactly what to do. And I was a woman who knew, when the moment came in a restaurant on a Wednesday night in April, exactly what kind of champagne to ask for. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell me about the time you waited. Tell me about the sister or the brother or the friend who knew before you did and was kind enough to let you find out in your own time. Tell me what you ordered when the moment came. I read every single one. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. There are more stories like this on this channel. The link is in the description. I will see you in the next one. Thank you for being here.